Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Marty Podskoch. He has written several books on fire towers in the Adirondacks and the Catskills. So welcome.
Nice to be here, Joe.
People watching may know Marty from, he was just here talking about the Civilian Conservation Corps camps in the library. So anyway, the books. Before we start, give us a little, like I say, the capsule biography, what you've been doing before all this started, and sort of, so then people get a sense of where you're coming from. So,
Right. I'm from the Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania area. I taught in New Jersey, and then I met my wife, and we came to Delhi, where I taught for 28 years. And I did developmental reading in Delhi, Delaware Academy. And while I went hiking with a professor from Delhi Tech. We went up to Hunter Mountain in the fall, and when we got up to the top of the mountain, it was snowing. We had about 4 inches of snow, and there was a little guy who was in the cabin, came out. Smoke was coming from the cabin, and he said, "Hey guys, you want to come in and get warm?" So we went into the cabin and gave us some water, and he told us how he was a retired fireman from New York City. Came back to Tannersville, and his daughter was an observer on the tower, and he took her place the next year.
wait, when you were, was a tower up there?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they were still using the fire towers in, this was 1987.
Okay.
And I came back from the mountain, and I was thinking, gosh, there must be other stories about men and women up in these towers. Maybe that would be great for a book, because I was a reading teacher, and I used to have book fairs where I used to have a lot of authors and publishers come to the school. So I told a publisher, Ray Rominger from Fleischman's Purple Mountain Press, about it. And a couple years later, he called me up in '97. He said, "Marty, they're trying to save the towers in the Catskills. How would you like to write a book?"
So just out of the
blue, I had a $100 advance, a contract, and I never wrote a book before.
Oh.
So my next thing was try to find some stories about what towers were there and who was on the towers, and go and interview them.
So how did, in these books, I know in the Adirondacks there's 57 towers, and it takes up 2 books. The Catskill, how many towers were there?
In the blue line of the Catskill Preserve, there were only about 8.
Oh, okay.
But that, I figured, God, that's going to be a short book, and the people that live in the surrounding area still consider them part of the Catskills, and so I included the ones that surrounded the Catskills, so I had a total of 23.
So how did you, I know these books are actually, you gathered all these stories from former observers and rangers. How did you gather all these stories?
Well, I would go into the town where I knew that there was a tower, stop at stores, maybe a bar, a restaurant. People would tell me so-and-so was an observer, they're still alive, or their children were alive, and I would contact them and then get their stories. And over 2 years, I was able to get quite a few stories.
So you basically just come into town and say, "I'm looking for former
Right.
fire tower people."
Or talk to forest rangers,
But
because they knew some of them,
Yeah.
or the children of the
Yeah.
observers gave me stories and pictures.
And then I would think, did word spread that, hey, someone's looking for
Sometimes somebody would be doing that, but as you could see by my Catskill book, it was only about 120 pages, so I was in my beginning stages of tracking down and researching. So when I got to my next book, I have 250 pages. And then the last book, I was 350 pages.
They got bigger as they...
So I got better at finding who the observers were, tracking them down, going into towns and giving talks like I'm doing today. I gave today at your library, and people are in the audience. They say, oh, you know, my father was an observer or worked at the CCC camps, and that leads to another story and gathering information. So for 5 years, I gave talks in the Adirondacks at historical societies, at libraries, wherever I could give a talk, and people would take me into their house. You know, the librarians or somebody in town would give me a place to stay. Then I would go to the next town and give talks. And during the day, I was interviewing people, and at night, I was giving talks and finding more people. So that's the way I've been able to gather these stories.
It sounds like it just snowballed. So how did, one thing that's mentioned here, give us a sense of the mileage you put on and the years, because I think in one book you mentioned 40,000 miles a year. Was that a year in your car? Or?
Probably approximating, especially going to the Adirondacks, because from Delhi just to Northville was a 2-hour drive. Okay. So that's 120 miles. So that to go up to Potsdam or Malone area, that would be a 5-hour trip. And sometimes, like on a Saturday, I was still teaching, I would drive up in the morning, leave early. And one time I went up to Lewis County, I interviewed 12 people. I had things lined up, one after the other, and then got back in the evening, 8 or 9 o'clock, to Delhi. And so that's the way I got these stories, because there aren't any books on.
Well, it actually sounds like as they say, a labor of love. What could you say about the observers? I mean, many of these observers were observers for decades. I mean, what were these people like, I guess is what I'm trying to...
Well, most of these people, at first, they just loved nature. Mm-hmm. This was a place to have a job, even though it was just 7 months. They worked from April until about November. See, in April was the time where in the valleys, you'd have a lot of dry season. The leaves were there, the dry grass, you had a lot of fires. So the observer would go up to the top of the mountain, say it was snowy, and he might have to use snowshoes just to get up there. It might be 2 or 3 feet of snow to get up on top of the mountain. Yet in the valley, you'd have a lot of grass fires. So they had to get up there. They had to make sure the telephone lines were working, and some of them were knocked down over the winter time. And the early telephones were what they call bare wire. They were just iron with copper coating, and they were on these glass insulators that were attached to pegs onto trees.
And just went right through the...
And going, say like, excuse me, Snowy Mountain, 5 miles through the woods, all the way up to the top of the mountain, so that if that phone was not working, that observer had to leave the tower and check every inch of that trail of the telephone line to see if there was a branch knocked on it, because they didn't have coating, rubber coating or plastic. It was just bare wire.
I'm thinking that probably happened a lot. They went out.
There were, especially with storms and branch blowdowns.
Well, before we actually talk about some of these, why don't you tell us first about how it was the early 1900s, how all these towers sort of came into existence. I didn't know until I was looking through these books there were that many fires, say, in the Adirondacks, because we never really hear of big forest fires in the Catskills or Adirondacks. But tell us about the early history and how these sort of came about.
Yeah. Well, around the early 1900s, especially 1903, 1908 were big years where maybe it didn't rain for 6 weeks. You know, like we have drought in the southeastern part or in California. Well, this was what happened here in the Adirondacks in the springtime. And so we had all of the dry forest, and it had been, a lot of places had been logged, and they would just leave the tops of the trees. And as the trains, which were bringing people, and they were also transporting some of the logs out, as the trains went by, they were burning coal and wood. So you had all these sparks flying off out of the smokestacks onto the area along the tracks, and you had all this debris left by slash left by the loggers, so you had a lot of fires. One fire below Old Forge, I think it was 23,000 acres.
Oh.
And once that fire would go,
Yeah.
how could you stop it?
Well, I think
Okay.
in one of these was in the early between 1900 and 1910. There was these massive hundreds of thousands of acres. There was some fires like that.
Yeah, as they kept going, and the only way that they had of fighting these fires, they didn't have forest rangers. They had what they called fire wardens. There were a few men spaced out throughout the Adirondack Mountains, 6 million acres.
Yeah.
So once a fire got going, these men, they didn't have fire towers. If they heard or they could see smoke, then they would try to get some men who would, that they called fire wardens, to assist to help them fight it. And they just had bucket brigades. They didn't even have the Indian tanks yet.
Yeah.
So once these fires got going, it took hundreds of men to be able to put out these fires.
And then obviously the idea came about for.
Yeah, in 1905, the commissioner of Maine realized up there in Maine that let's put towers and put men, observers, on top of their mountains. And equip them with telephones in 1905, binoculars and crude maps. And when they could see smoke in the distance with their binoculars, they would get on the old crank telephone, call the forest ranger, and then they would get a crew of men to go and put the fire out. But now they were getting to the fire at its inception, its beginning stages. So in 1908, our state of New York was really beleaguered. They didn't know what to do, so they got this letter from the commissioner of Maine. They said, we have the solution. We put men on top of mountains with towers, telephones, binoculars, and maps.
So Maine had been doing this for.
Maine had been doing it since 1905.
Okay.
So in 1909, New York State decided we're going to do the same thing. And the first mountain was Mount Morris in Tupper Lake.
Okay.
And they followed with other mountains, putting men, and then each year they kept increasing the amount of fire towers throughout the Adirondacks and the state, so that now they could be able to cover a majority of the Adirondacks and get the fire at its beginning stages. And in 1912, too, we had the founding of the Forest Rangers and the starting of the Forest Ranger School in Wanakena, too. So now we had Forest Rangers who supervised these towers and the observers.
So I think on these towers, I think you were telling me earlier, they were pretty active until like 1970. Is that what you were around there?
Yeah, around 1971, the state came up with the idea we got to cut down on the budget. This is when we had, now it wasn't the Conservation Department, it was the Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, and they heard about studies that have been done in Canada where they would use airplanes as spotters and just send up planes and pay the pilots when it was hot, dry, and windy.
Only when it, okay.
And so that's what the state did, and they started closing some of these towers down because now, because there were certain times when it was rainy, or certain years when you wouldn't have the fire threat. So they would be saving money and not sending airplanes up. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, say the pilot won a contract. There was one in Saratoga, one in Schenectady, sometimes one on 8th Lake, Bird. They would get the call if they had a contract. There were 23 routes throughout the state. When that district ranger, say in Northville or in Old Forge or Raybrook, saw that the conditions were really bad, he would call up the pilot and say, Joe, I want you to be able to fly today. So they would fly, and they would fly a certain route. And as they were flying, it might take 2 hours to fly this route. And as they were going, they had the advantage. They could fly right over a smoke and see, oh, it's only a camper.
Okay.
No, boy, this is a really bad fire. They could stay there in that area. They could call the nearest tower that was still open. They could also call the forest ranger. They could even guide the forest ranger in the truck because
from the plane,
Yeah, okay. To get to the fire. That was the advantage. So it was cheaper. They could be able to get closer to the fire. The disadvantage is once they made their route over a certain area, maybe an hour later, a fire developed. So once that plane was gone, that was gone. Unless it was really dry, the district ranger would call 12 o'clock. I want you to go a second route. Then they would be paid for a second route. Okay. And sometimes it was really bad. These pilots, which they liked it because then they were paid for 3 times flying out, and sometimes they would even take some passengers, just to help them with spotting and maybe make a few bucks. But most of the time that was just their responsibility. And they had they had big maps, I should say, and most of these pilots, though, were very good. They knew the area. Yeah. Some of them didn't even need a map, although some of the younger pilots, they didn't know the mountain area as well.
And then today, I think I was asking, what do they do today? You said they depend on you and me and whoever to spot fires, basically, and call them in.
They don't use satellites, like some people are saying. There's something they use pilots. No, the last year that they used the pilots on a regular basis was 1986.
Okay.
And so by 1990, the last 3 towers in the Adirondacks were open. I think it was Blue Mountain, St. Regis, and Hadley. And then after that, they were all closed.
So, however, though, you were telling me earlier, now we can talk about this, many of these now are being restored, and people can go out and see what they were like. And what's there, about a dozen have been restored? Or
about 12. In the 1990s, a lot of the local people saw the towers were being closed, and they thought, well, maybe it'll be like the other towers where they just came and took them apart, or they just cut them down, just like trees, and dropped them, and then used a helicopter to take them up and just salvage them, just use the pieces. And so they said, oh, but these towers, like Blue Mountain, were so great to take your families up there. You'd get up to the top of the mountain. If you're on Blue Mountain, you couldn't see anything because of the trees. Whereas if the tower was there and you climbed the 65-foot tower, the kids, the grandchildren, and your sons and daughters never forget this. Climbing a tower, as you said, you used to enjoy climbing a fire tower, and that was an adventure. And
I still remember it as a kid. I remember the round thing, or not
the map table.
The map table, and they had a
Alidade.
And then it had the map of the area, and if there was a fire, they could have coordinates or something.
Yeah, they would line up the arrow and then look on the map table at the azimuth reading, a number, and then they would call that into the forest ranger. And then sometimes another observer on another tower, he or she would see it, the fire, and using triangulation could be able to pinpoint the fire.
Well, in case people want to visit what are some of the, I mean, I know you don't know every single one, but what are some of the ones where people maybe could still go if they wanted to take a hike and go up them?
Some of the towers have been restored by local people, and they have volunteers, maybe on the weekends, that they go up there and they'll spend the whole day and talk to the people, show them about how the map table works and the history of the fire towers up there. And some of them, like Mount Arab, Moonshine, they
where are they?
Okay, Mount Arab is to the west of Tupper Lake.
Okay.
On Route 3, and Moonshine is by Plattsburgh.
Okay.
You could see it right off of 87 as you're going up there. They have a program, an outdoor education program of some kind with Potsdam, where this professor assigns students to go to this tower. They're paid, and they get college credit
Okay, so
And then there is one in Hadley where the local people there plus international paper raise money and fund to pay this college student to be up there to stay in the cabin and during the day be an interpretive guide.
now, where's Hadley? I'm not sure.
Hadley is by Lake Luzerne.
Okay, Lake Luzerne.
Lake
And
Luzerne.
Are there any sort of close by us in the Capital District? That
One that is possibly close to you is by Caroga Lake. It's called Cane Mountain. It's a
Okay.
very easy
Yeah.
walk, okay? Then if you go to Old Forge, there's Bald Mountain, and that tower has been restored. Then Blue
is that
Mountain.
the one I was telling you he looks down on the...
Right, and it's
Okay.
an easy walk
Yes,
too,
that's a
less
nice-
than an hour.
That's a
And
nice one.
That's the tower that most people throughout the years visited because you get a lot of tourists to
Yeah.
Old Forge area. Blue Mountain you could visit.
Okay.
Hadley by Lake Luzerne, where they have an interpretive guide. Polka Moonshine by Plattsburgh. Then, as I said, Arab is by Tupper Lake. Azure Mountain is 37 miles east of Potsdam.
Okay.
It's near St. Regis Falls.
And
they-
the Indian reservation up there, is it near there?
No, it's right near the town.
Okay.
And it's on Blue Mountain
Okay.
Road. And what else? Oh, there's one in Wanakena, too,
And where's,
at the Ranger School. It's to the west of Cranberry Lake.
are any in the Catskills restored? Or you're
The Catskills, the five towers in the Catskills have been restored. Hunter Mountain
Okay, everyone, I think most
by
people know where Hunter,
Tannersville.
where Hunter Mountain
by
is.
Woodstock. It's
Okay.
called Overlook Mountain. And that's a gorgeous view. You could see the whole, I shouldn't say the whole, the Hudson Valley
Oh,
from
yeah.
up there. And you might even get a chance to see a rattlesnake, too, or a bear.
Well, well, that's one thing I was going to ask you. In these books, they're set up, each tower has the history, a little page or two on the history. Then the lore, some of these go on for 3 and 4 and 5 pages. And what you've done, you've gathered these stories of the observers and the rangers, and they do have stories about rattlesnakes and bears. And what I was telling you before, it seems like a romantic thing, working in a fire tower, but tell us about sort of how they actually lived. I mean, it really wasn't that romantic, I think,
Yeah.
if you...
Well, they had to walk up and come down the mountain, too, for supplies. Unless they called a family member, because they had a telephone, they could call up, and then they might bring them up supplies. They lived in a small cabin, which had a nice wood stove in one room, which was a combination living room, dining room.
Now, would the cabin be right at the base of the
Most
tower, or was it some...
in the Catskills, they were right near the tower.
Okay.
But in the Adirondacks, for some reason, maybe because they were higher mountains, a lot of them were a mile away from the tower. So these observers would hike up, to the cabin. Then every morning they had
Up to
another mile hike up to the top of the mountain to spend the day, say 9 o'clock till about 5 o'clock, then come back down the mountain to stay in the cabin.
Now, what about now, they weren't up there at night? Obviously, it wasn't a 24-hour
Right,
day
they're
tower,
right.
but-
Well, you couldn't see smoke at nighttime, and that's what they were
Okay,
looking
so
for.
smoke was the main...
Smoke
okay,
was the
that's
key
right.
thing.
I
And if it was like Whiteface Mountain, where a lot of times it was shrouded in clouds, if
Yeah.
you ever go by Whiteface,
Yeah.
a lot of times that observer couldn't even see anything on certain days. So during the daytime, the ranger would drive up there and take the observer and do trail work or painting, doing some other work to helping the forest ranger because you couldn't see anything up there on that mountain.
But it was, from some of these stories and the way they lived, it was kind of a, I wouldn't say, it was a kind of a hard lifestyle, wasn't it, wouldn't you say? I
Yeah,
mean,
well, right, they had an outhouse. They had to carry their water from, all depend, maybe it might have been a mile. Who knows where the local spring was that they could get water. Might carry it in their Indian tank up there. They had one bedroom. They had a pantry. And, of course, it wasn't well insulated.
Oh, yeah.
So you can imagine how cold not only the cabin was, but in April or in October, sitting up there in that 7x7 cab, you just had windows, So it was cold. Sometimes these guys might have a little heater inside of it, or just, bundled up in a sleeping bag or whatever to keep them warm.
They really couldn't. Well, how big would the tower be?
7 feet by 7 feet.
All right, so they probably didn't have much room to move around.
No. And then
but you were saying before, these people, the observers, they really loved the outdoors. They must have really.
They loved it, and the people who hiked up there loved to come up there and hear the stories. And sometimes, of course, they were tall tales.
Yeah.
These guys would say how they would make up stories, and the gullible, city people would believe these things.
What would be some of the examples?
Maybe like
a Bigfoot or something.
Well, one of them guys, they said they made up some kind of an animal which had short legs on the left side of their body and long legs on the right side of their body to be able to walk around the mountain.
Okay.
And as I said, a lot of these people came up there, and the early people came up there. They didn't have hiking clothes. They had these beautiful dresses. The woman hiking, you could look through the book, see these old pictures of them hiking up there. And they love to hear these stories of the observers.
Well,
and the beautiful view.
The books do have a lot, for people watching, if they buy these books, or our library owns all of them, there are a lot of pictures in here, and they do look. Some of these observers look like these crusty old. Well, the ones then, and when it gets into the 50s and 60s, it looks a little different. What I'm going to do now is we only have a couple minutes left. I'm going to tell people, a lot of people were here today watching your talk on the Civilian Conservation Corps camps. If you wanted to just briefly talk about those in the Adirondacks, and then we're going to put, as we speak, underneath, if anyone wants to email you, because you're always looking for people who either worked at one or had a family member at one, because you're collecting stories for a book about the Civilian Conservation Corps camps in the Adirondacks. So we'll put your email address on there and your website if people want to go and find some information. But tell us about the book you're working on now about the camps, the CCC camps in the Adirondacks in the 30s.
Yeah, for the past year, started last year, I've been going around. I gave 54 talks this past year, and I go into towns and tell people about the history and lore that I've been able to find, and more people come out. And I also have newspapers put articles about that I'm searching for people. And people come out. Like 2 weeks ago, I was in Glens Falls and interviewed 12 men in that Glens Falls area who were in the CCC camps, and they shared their pictures. And hopefully I'll have a book out on the 25 CCC camps that were in the Adirondacks for next year, which will be the 75th anniversary.
2008.
Right.
Should be done by. Okay.
I'm hoping.
Well, I know. Well, today at the library, you had someone in the audience who was at one of those camps. You were telling me.
Right.
So people can, if they know people that want to get in touch with you, like I say, your email will be under the screen.
And phone
here.
number there.
Okay.
And the idea that they took these, Roosevelt started this whole program in the Depression to take the boys off the street, to give them a job, give them some.
Well, I should say that these were nationwide.
Yes.
But your book is about just the
Adirondack. Okay. Just in the Adirondacks. And they planted trees, built bridges, and a lot of our state and national parks are all built because of these CCC boys just from 1933 to 1942. So
I read a little bit about it because I knew you were coming to the library. What they did was pretty amazing. I mean, all the stuff. Now, we didn't get to this one. I'll just tell people briefly about this book. It's called Adirondack Stories. What they are, they're these one-page, well, tell us what they're
illustrated stories.
One-page illustrated story about
of people and events that I've heard as I've been driving around the Adirondacks doing my fire tower stories. I've found other stories about interesting people. And then I teamed up with this 82-year-old comic book illustrator, Sam Glanzman from near Oneonta. And every week in the Gloversville, Johnstown paper, the Boonville newspaper, Lowville, Saranac Lake paper, and once a month in the Hamilton County newspaper, I've got these illustrated stories, just with a caption underneath it, and just gives you something interesting because, just to catch the attention,
Yeah.
interest of people that they might even want to find out more information, say about the terrible windstorm of 1845, or the summer that we didn't even, that was just like a winter.
Well, there's one in here where, was it Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Russell Lowell, Oliver Wendell Holmes, I'm sorry, John Holmes, brother of Oliver Wendell Holmes. They had a philosopher's camp up there.
Right, up
Well,
near
it
Mount
says in the
Morris.
back here that these are about, each story is about either a famous Adirondack guide, a hunter, a hermit, a hotel, a writer, an artist, explorers, lumbering, tanneries, railroads, boats, sports, amusement parks. I think there's one on Frontier Town. Most people my age probably remember going to Frontier Town. So, Marty Podskoch, we really appreciate you stopping by. When you get your CCC camp book out, we'll have to have you come back if you're going to be in the area. I know you live in Connecticut, but thanks a lot for being on Meet the Author.
Well, thanks a lot, Joe, for having me, and I really enjoyed talking to the people today, too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, this is Joe Nash. Thanks for watching Meet the Author, and we'll see you next time.